This is possibly the most tragic story that you will ever hear. My heart is literally broken. I read this story over the weekend. I wanted to talk to you about it today. Your heart will break. My heart is breaking.
Unfortunately, I can't show you this part of the show, or the big tech overlords might delete this video and my channel. As you know, YouTube won't let me tell you the truth about COVID-19 or transgenderism and other important issues, even when I cite the specific studies. So if you want to watch the full uncensored version of this video, join me over on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals, lizwheelershow.com/locals.
You will not believe, by the way, the horrifying history of forced vaccination in our country, and we're going to get to that in just a moment. I'm Liz Wheeler. Welcome to the Liz Wheeler Show. So I was talking to you guys on Instagram this weekend. I think it was Friday, or this past weekend on Friday, and I asked what topics you wanted to talk about and what shows you wanted to hear, and the top voted show topic, the top voted show title was the history of forced vaccination in the United States. And I did a little deep dive into that topic this weekend. And boy, oh boy, basically to sum it up, the history of forced vaccination here in the United States is racist. We're going to get to that in a second. But first, I want to talk to you about Headspace. So you've probably tried meditation before. Maybe it didn't work, or maybe you felt like you were doing it wrong. I know that's the case with me. So if mental health is part of your self-care plan this year, you owe it to yourself to try Headspace. Headspace is your daily dose of relaxation in the form of guided meditations, and it all comes in an easy-to-use app on your smartphone. So whatever the situation, Headspace really can help you feel better. Overwhelmed? Headspace got you covered. A 3-minute meditation for you. Need help falling asleep? Headspace has wind-down sessions that the members swear by, and parents, Headspace even has morning meditations you can do with your kids. Headspace's approach helps reduce stress, improve sleep, boost focus, increase your overall sense of well-being. You deserve to feel happier. And Headspace is meditation made simple. So go to headspace.com/Liz. That's headspace.com/Liz for a free 1-month trial with access to Headspace's full library of meditations for every situation. This is the best deal offered right now. Head to headspace.com/Liz. You have to use my promo code, though, to get this very good deal, this limited time deal. It's the best deal offered right now. head to headspace.com/Liz. We know politics is stressful. Headspace can help relieve some of that stress. Headspace.com/Liz. Okay, so we all know that Governor Gavin Newsom mandated the COVID-19 vaccine for school children in the state of California as soon as it becomes fully FDA approved. All school children, public school and private school, are forced to get this vaccine, and Newsom justifies it as follows. Take a listen.
That's why we recognize our responsibility to do more, and that's what we are announcing here today. A statewide requirement for in-person instruction for all of our children to add to a well-established list that currently includes 10 vaccinations and well-established rules and regulations that have been advanced by the legislature for decades, to add to that list the vaccination for COVID-19. We intend to do that once the FDA has fully approved the vaccine, which will give us time to work with districts, give us time to work with parents.
So I love how when he's talking about the history of mandated vaccination in our country, he only mentions the public school vaccine, or the vaccines that are mandated for public school kids. What are there, 10 vaccines that you have to give to your kid if you want to send them to public school? That's the only part of the history of mandated vaccines that Newsom mentions. And you'll see why. I wonder why when you actually learn what the truth of mandated forced vaccination is in our country. So just keep that in mind as we move forward. So what we're facing here is we're facing in states like California, we're facing school children having the vax mandated. We're facing in New York City, a citywide mandate or quasi-mandate where New York is forcing private enterprise, gyms, restaurants, entertainment venues to enforce the vaccine mandate on their customers. We see the same thing in San Francisco. On a federal level, we see Biden with his OSHA employer vax mandate, his military mandate, his mandate for federal government employees and contractors. And by the way, just one quick word here on the OSHA mandate, the mandate from Biden, where he says that if you're an employer who has over 100 employees, then you are required to mandate it for your employees. You'll notice that Biden did not actually mandate it himself. He didn't say, every worker, you have to be mandated. He's just trying to force the employer to do it. Why? Because Biden knows he has zero constitutional authority to dictate this to employers. He has zero constitutional authority to dictate that employers force their employees to be vaccinated either. I mean, I fully expect this particular vaccine mandate to be overturned. I hope I'm correct. I hope there are enough credible, constitutional-minded judges on the bench in our judicial system that they will overturn this regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat or like the vaccine or hate the vaccine or who cares what their opinion is. The precedent here is they should overturn this because the emergency temporary standard that Biden is trying to use, that's a Labor Department, by the way, a sub-agency of the Labor Department, the Occupations Health and Safety Administration, that's OSHA. They issued a rule, not a law, a rule, using an emergency temporary standard that allows them to bypass normal rulemaking and regulatory processes. And the rule that they used says the secretary, the Labor Department, shall provide without regard to the requirements of Chapter 5 of Title 5 for an emergency temporary standard to take immediate effect upon publication in the Federal Register if he determines that A, employees are exposed to grave danger from exposure to substances or agents determined to be toxic or physically harmful, or from new hazards, and B, that such emergency standard is necessary to protect employees from danger. So this doesn't take a rocket scientist to know, to question, I should say, has OSHA determined that all large employers are exposing all employees to grave danger? Well, no, they're not. Even without a vaccine mandate, they're not, because the employees have the opportunity to get the vaccine themselves so they can protect themselves from any danger that they might feel going into a place of employment where they might contract COVID-19. So it doesn't even make any sense. That's the first thing. The second thing is emergency temporary standards are, as the name suggests, temporary. Permanent standards are differently governed, and vaccines are not a temporary thing. Vaccines are supposedly, maybe not with the COVID-19 vaccine, but wouldn't that be a funny argument coming from the government? Vaccines are permanent. So if this were permanent, then OSHA would have to make a, quote, threshold finding that a place of employment is unsafe in the sense that significant risks are present and can be eliminated or lessened by a change in practices. Again, vaccines are not supposed to be temporary, regardless of whether the COVID-19 vaccine has permanent efficacy or not. They're supposedly permanent. They are a permanent thing that you do to your body. You can't undo them. Okay, so like I said, a little tangential on Biden's OSHA thing. I fully expect this to be overturned. It should be overturned. The last time the federal government used OSHA, used an emergency temporary standard. It was regarding asbestos. It was overturned in the courts. That was the last time an administration tried to use that. So as I said, we're seeing this influx of vaccine mandates, private sector, kind of private sector, the government coercing the private sector in schools. At the federal level, Senator Dianne Feinstein has introduced a bill to force a vaccine passport for domestic air travel. She wants the airlines to make people prove they're vaccinated. So in response to all of this, I think specifically in response to Governor Newsom's mandate for school children, Congressman Jim Jordan tweeted, "Vaccine mandates are un-American, period." That's all he tweeted. And I think he's right. I think he's correct. The idea of government being so powerful that they can force you to do something with your body that you otherwise don't want to do, I mean, that's fundamentally anti-American because that's fundamentally anti-liberty. That the philosophy of the thing is a conversation for a different day. We're talking about the history of vaccine mandates here. So the response from the left and from the mainstream media to Jim Jordan's tweet, the immediate response, I mean, you can just do a quick Google search of Jim Jordan vaccine mandates are un-American, and all these mainstream media outlets had the same response. They were like, no, Jim Jordan's wrong. He's incorrect. We actually have a long history of forced vaccination and vaccine mandates in the United States of America. And so here's what I would say. Well, yes, technically, they are correct. We actually do have a history of vaccine mandates in the United States of America. But just because we have a history of something, does that automatically make it correct to do now? We have a history of slavery in this country. We have a history of racial discrimination. We have a history of subjugation of women. We have a history of internment camps for Asian Americans because of the way that they look. We have a history of suspension of habeas corpus. But does that make it right, or would it make it right for us to implement those violations of liberty now just because we have a history of it? Obviously not. Obviously not. And such is the same with vaccine mandates. And the precedent, by the way, the precedent that was set by the Supreme Court, this case that the left always talks about, this 1905 ruling from the Supreme Court that says that government can actually mandate vaccines. This was a terrible ruling, first of all, but the precedent, the far-reaching impacts of this Supreme Court ruling, it went beyond vaccination, and it literally, not figuratively, it literally harmed tens of thousands of women in our nation. It's shocking. We're going to get to that in 1 second, but first I want to talk to you about Paint Your Life. So we have a new sponsor, Paint Your Life, paintyourlife.com, and it's super cool. I love it. So how it works is this. You take a photograph of your favorite memory and you send it in to paintyourlife.com. They have a professional artist paint a portrait of your photo, and then they mail you that portrait. And my producers submitted a photo on my behalf. I don't know what it is, and it arrived. So I wanna see what it is. I want to reveal it, and I thought we could do that right now. Let's do it right now. I literally did not peek. I promise I did not peek. I did not open the box before right now. I do not know what this is going to be, but this is what they got for me. Let me look. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh, it's Sweet Ugly George. It's Sweet Ugly George. Do you guys remember Sweet Ugly George? Our post-production manager, Victoria, adopted this hideous, horrible beast with this terrible underbite, and she thinks he's a beautiful dog. I love this so much. This is so funny. This is not what I was expecting, actually. What I was expecting is I thought you were going to send me a picture of Spencer, a big portrait of Spencer. Sweet Ugly George will forever hang in my studio. This is so great. As you can see, you can pick any picture that you want. You can do a wedding anniversary. You can do your grandchildren. You can do a favorite pet. You can do the ugliest dog in the entire world. Whatever is meaningful to you, you just submit your photo. There's an approval process where you'll approve the draft of the painting before it happens, and then they'll send it to you. It's actually not that expensive. When I looked into this, I figured it would be expensive. It's really not. And if you don't love the final painting, your money is refunded, guarantee. Right now, limited time offer, you can get 20% off your painting. That's right, 20% off and free shipping. To get this special offer, you have to text the word Liz, my name, text the word Liz to 64,000. That's Liz to 64,000. Paint Your Life is obviously so much fun. Celebrate the moments that matter most, or the dogs that you think are the literal ugliest dogs in the world. Sweet Ugly George, memorialized forever. Thank you. Thank you to my team for this hilarious surprise. I really do like it. It's great. So this 1905 Supreme Court ruling ruled that the government does have the power. I don't want to say the authority because that at least insinuates that it's somewhat legitimate, and I don't believe that it is. But it gave governments the authority to mandate vaccines if they believe that it's an epidemic or if they believe that it's an emergency, if it's a reasonable infringement on people's liberty. It's sort of the general welfare type of argument here. But regardless, again, I think that's wrong. We can get into that. But the precedent set by Jacobson versus Massachusetts, this reasonable intrusion on your personal, well, on your personhood, really, it's not even personal liberty, it's on your person. This reasonable intrusion by the government on your person, this precedent, or this set the precedent for a notorious and infamous Supreme Court ruling called Buck versus Bell. In Buck versus Bell, the Supreme Court allowed the government to forcibly sterilize a woman because the allegation was that this woman was mentally unfit to be a mother. And so the government wanted to sterilize her body, take away her reproductive capacity, her womanhood, because they said that she was mentally unfit to be a mother. And the precedent, not the precedent, but the ramification from Buck versus Bell led to 60,000 women in the United States being forcibly sterilized by the government. Can you believe that? Can you believe that? And Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, this is what he wrote. He said, the principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. How awful is that? How truly awful is that? 60,000 women were sterilized based on the precedent set in Jacobson versus Massachusetts, which allowed the government to intrude on your person and forcibly vaccinate you. So the same ruling, the principle found in that ruling, justified eugenics in our country. Think about that. It justified eugenics. So yeah, there's a history of forced vaccination in our country, and that history, the precedent of that ruling, justified sterilizing women based on the idea of eugenics. So that's pretty awful. So I think we should decide collectively whether just because something's history, does it mean that we should repeat it, or should we learn from the mistakes that we've made in our history so that we don't intrude upon people's bodies the way that we have in the past. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, it was very interesting during this time. So this 1905 Supreme Court ruling was based on these series of sort of smallpox epidemics. And I say small epidemics because there was sort of a series of localized epidemics that happened at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century, that led to Jacobson refusing a vaccine mandate and then suing all the way to the Supreme Court. So these small epidemics of smallpox were handled at the local level, typically by counties. They were not handled at the federal level. In fact, the president at the time, Teddy Roosevelt, wasn't involved. He was actually criticized because he was so uninvolved in what was going on with those epidemics. But maybe that's the place for the local government, for county public health officials, or for states, not really for the federal government. Actually, it was rarely even the states. It was mostly county public health officials. This was before the administrative state that we always talk about, before the expansion of the federal government. So that's the other thing, is if we're actually talking historical precedent, then we should look at which government officials were actually involved, because it really wasn't the federal government. But let's talk about smallpox for a second, because remember when I debated Benjamin Wittes on Newsweek's The Debate podcast, and he repeatedly brought up the smallpox vaccine, and he said it was mandated, and he thought it was a trick question to ask me whether I believed in smallpox vaccine mandates. And, I called him out on the debate tactic, but I want to talk about that tonight because it's so interesting. It's so interesting when we ask the question, what is the history with the smallpox vaccine mandate? Because that was the first vaccine mandate that our country had faced. What is the history? And should it be repeated as it was done? So this weekend, I delved into this question. I tried to do some in-depth research. I read a book called Pox in American History by author Michael Wilrich. And I will warn you from the outset, if you plan to read that book, he's very liberal and he draws some liberal conclusions in this book, but it does have some very, very interesting and illuminating historical facts. And here's what I found from this book and other sources, individual independent sources as well. So if we're talking about the history of government intrusion during epidemics or pandemics, and as it relates to vaccine mandates, here's what some of the things that our governments, our local governments, our public health officials, and our state governments did to the American people, how they infringed upon our liberties during outbreaks of smallpox. So one of the things that they did, and we actually now, you and I, we hear about this only in Australia when we hear about these detention camps set up in Queensland, Or we heard about it, this very radical leftist individual in the New York State Assembly had proposed this, I think this was over a year ago, this idea of these forced detention facilities where people, if they'd been just suspected of being exposed to COVID, would be required to keep themselves in these detention facilities. Horrifying stuff. Well, that's actually happened in our country already. And back then, at the beginning of the 1900s, during these smallpox outbreaks, they were called pest houses. Pest houses. And if you were sick with smallpox, or if you were even suspected of being sick, you were forcibly taken to these pest houses. Now, you didn't get hospital care. You barely got medical care there. In fact, those who were exposed to smallpox or suspected of being sick but not sick yet, they were the ones that were forced to care for the sick people. You had a higher chance of survival back then if you were cared for at home with family than if you were forcibly taken to a pest house. So it's no wonder that a lot of families kept it secret if a family had smallpox and instead cared for that family member at their home. But you were forced to go to a pest house. In fact, it wasn't just adults. There were children who were ripped from their mother's arms and sent to die in these pest houses, including infants and babies. I could barely read this. Thinking about my own daughter, she's 8 months old. I was imagining if she got sick and someone came to my house and ripped her from my arms and forced her to go to a detention camp because she was ill, where no one cared for her. She got no medical care and she died over my literal dead body. Would that ever happen? Would that ever happen? But it happened. This is the history of how public health officials infringed on people's bodily liberty. This is the history of vaccine mandates in our country. This happened in the United States of America. And during these smallpox outbreaks, there were cities and localities that proposed segregation. I'm talking about racial segregation. White people over here, black people over here, in the name of public health. They were quick to blame, to blame others, to blame out-of-towners, to blame black people, to blame racial minorities, to blame anybody at all. And the result of that fear of being infected by someone who doesn't look like you, they proposed racial segregation. So all of this, when I say that there's racism inherent to these vaccine mandates, oh, just you wait. It gets much, much worse. So when it comes to the actual vaccination mandates, there were vaccination corps. I'm talking nighttime raids by police officers. These police officers would come up to people's houses. They would take their nightsticks. They would rap on people's doors because they knew they would be home at 3 a.m. They would force people to show on their arms whether they had the mark of the smallpox vaccine. And if they didn't, they literally forced them to get vaccinated. I'm talking, they arrested people. They put them in handcuffs. And they forcibly vaccinated them at gunpoint. This is the history of vaccine mandates in our country. So yeah, we do have a history of vaccine mandates, of forced vaccination in our country, and it's not a good history. Cities were giving public health officials at the time the power to vaccinate people with or without their consent. And you think this is bad, this is horrendous? And it is. It's bad and horrendous. But who were targeted by these vaccination corps, these task forces of police officers and city vaccinators? Who were targeted? Black Americans, Black neighborhoods, buildings that housed Black people. That's who was targeted. That's who had police officers rapping on their door, beating down their door at 3 a.m., arresting them, handcuffing them, and vaccinating them forcibly at gunpoint. Black Americans, that's who. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, these were race-neutral laws, right? They applied equally to everybody, and you'd be correct. Now, this is where it becomes very ironic because you and I know that critical race theory is racialism used as a tactic to usher in Marxism. But what the left claims critical race theory is, the left claims, and it's erroneous, but for the sake of this argument, we're going to talk about their premise. The left claims critical race theory is a way of looking at race-neutral laws to see whether there's a disproportionate impact on Black Americans, the impact of the law, regardless of whether there's any racial tone or racial motivation, or not racial motivation, but any racially charged language in that bill. They look at the actual impact of the bill. Does it disproportionately harm Black Americans? And the answer to that question of vaccine mandates, did vaccine mandates, racially neutral vaccine mandates, harm Black Americans disproportionately? Oh yeah, they did. Black Americans were specifically targeted. And yet, now Democrats want vaccine mandates and they're huge hypocrites. They're ignoring this premise of critical race theory that they claim critical race theory is just looking at the disproportionate impacts of race-neutral laws on Black Americans. They're ignoring it because it doesn't suit their political agenda on vaccine mandates. You cannot make up this irony. Democrats in this day and age, today's Democrats refuse to play by their own rules. They want to repeat a history that disproportionately violated Black people, Black bodies, Black Americans. Horrifying. So during these smallpox outbreaks, there was actually widespread opposition to vaccine mandates. There's also a history of that. People did not want to be told what to do. And one of the reasons that people were resistant to these vaccine mandates for the smallpox vaccine is because just like we're seeing today with COVID-19, there was an exaggerated fatality rate that was being peddled by public health officials. We were told, or people back then were told, that it was 20, 30, 40, 50% fatality because some strains of smallpox, there was that high of a fatality rate. But at the turn of the century back then, there was a new strain of smallpox that actually killed less than 1% of people it infected. Interesting how history repeats itself. So people were resistant to this vaccine mandate because they didn't feel that the vaccine was necessary or that their risk of smallpox weighed against their risk from the vaccine was a good risk that they wanted to take because of vaccine safety issues. Now, there were two different smallpox vaccines. The older one was where you scrape the arm versus the newer one was the vaccine or was the injection, maybe like the typical smallpox vaccine. But there were vaccine safety issues that people were afraid of back then. So with the inoculation where you scrape your arm, there was worry just about basic hygiene. You know, you could get syphilis, you could get tetanus from these vaccines. They were very unsafe. There was no regulation of the vaccine industry. You could get such bad, swollen, sore arms that working people missed works for weeks, and they couldn't afford to do that. You could actually get infected with the smallpox from these vaccines, and when you were infected with the smallpox from the inoculation, you could infect others. So people were worried, rightfully so, about the safety issue of some of these vaccines. And then when you contrast that with the fact that it was this new strain of smallpox that wasn't killing 30, 40, 50, 60% of people, people were very opposed to a vaccine mandates for the same reason as now. They had religious beliefs against forced vaccine. There were alternative medicine practitioners and people practicing alternative medicine who wanted to treat it in a different way. People were worried about government tyranny. They were worried that compulsory vaccination was this conspiracy, really, between corrupt public health officials, corrupt lawmakers, and corrupt vaccine manufacturers. This is the history of forced vaccination in our country. This is the history that the left isn't telling you the full story about. They just point to that 1905 Supreme Court ruling and say, well, we have a history of forced vaccination, vaccine mandates in our country. And sure, we do. But they're not telling you the whole story that it had these terrible racist repercussions, that there were these vaccine task force that were beating on people's doors, arresting them, handcuffing them, vaccinating them forcibly at gunpoint, that there was widespread resistance. There were societies, anti-vaccine mandate societies that were formed. There were legislative campaigns to repeal these mandates. There were court challenges. There was hiding of sick family members, forged vaccination cards, believe it or not. There was refusal to comply. There were people that burned down the pest houses to resist being taken there. There were fights with police. There was running away from vaccinators. I mean, this was heavy, deep stuff. A very serious, legitimate conflict between the American people and government that was overstepping their boundaries, even in the face of an epidemic. These public health officials were abusing their power. They were shutting down schools and churches and saloons. They were prohibiting people from assembling in streets. They were prohibiting kids from going outside. They were burning down privately owned residences if people in those residences were infected and they couldn't figure out a way to sanitize those houses. They were burning them down. This is the history of vaccine mandates in our country, and history repeats itself. This one is just going to kill you. The New York Times back then did the exact same thing. They were in favor of forced vaccination. This is what they said. This is not only a wise measure of personal precaution, but it is a public duty which every citizen owes it to those with whom he comes in daily contact. And the New York Times called those who resisted vaccine mandates, ready for this? Can't make this up, imbecile cranks influenced by foreign ideas. That's the New York Times. They haven't changed a bit. So the moral of this story here is, yeah, we do have a lot of history in our country, some of which should be repeated and some of which should not be repeated. We shouldn't be repeating slavery. We shouldn't be repeating racial discrimination. We shouldn't be repeating subjugation of women. We shouldn't be repeating putting Asian Americans in internment camps. And we shouldn't be repeating vaccine mandates that are an abuse of power, that are tyrannical, that are a violation of people's inherent individual liberty, a violation of their body. We should not be repeating this. And yet the Democrats don't want you to know the whole story. And they, of course, advocate for this very history to be repeated. It's absolutely horrifying. At the same time, our public health officials, our CDC director in particular, in this day and age, Walensky, she admitted something this week that if you or I said, we'd be kicked off big tech. We're going to talk about that in a second. But first, I'm headed to college campuses across America this fall in partnership with my friends at the Young America's Foundation. At these campus events, I'll be able to talk directly with you and your peers about the issues that affect all of our lives, maybe vaccine mandates. Plus, I'll be taking questions live. Now, YAF is the master of these campus events. They've been hosting speakers on campus for literally decades. I am thrilled and honored to be working with YAF to come visit your school. So please put in a request, do it now, to host an event with me on your campus this fall. It's super easy, but spots are filling up very quickly. All you have to do is go to lizwheelershow.com/YAF. That's lizwheelershow.com/YAF. I've always loved meeting students on campuses and at YAF's conferences. It's one of my favorite parts of my job. We're going to talk about all kinds of things: foreign policy, abortion, vaccine mandates, cancel culture, feminism. You know it's going to get interesting during the Q&A when the leftists show up. So don't miss out. Put in a request today. If you know a student in your life who is on campus, don't wait. Go to lizwheelershow.com/YAF. lizwheelershow.com/YAF, and I'll see you on campus this fall. So Dr. Fauci is perhaps the most ridiculous person on the face of the earth. I'm surprised that Democrats even embrace him anymore because he's an embarrassment even to the left. Listen to what he admitted this weekend about his strategy to eradicate COVID from our country. Take a listen.
It is an assumption that is okay to get infected and to get mild and moderate disease as long as you don't wind up in the hospital and die. And I have to be open and honest. I reject that. I think we should be preventing people from getting sick from COVID, even if they don't wind up in the hospital.
There it is. You heard it for yourself. Now, you and I have been saying for a long time now that Fauci's strategy is not to eliminate deaths from COVID-19. It's not to mitigate hospitalizations from COVID-19. We've said, well, it's obvious that Fauci's strategy is zero COVID, which is a patently ridiculous strategy because you can't just eradicate COVID. It's endemic now. Just like our medical system has never been able to eradicate the common cold. Even with a vaccine, we can't eradicate the flu because the strains mutate. COVID-19 is the same way. You don't have to be a scientist to see that for yourself. But we've said, well, Fauci's advocating for zero COVID. That's why his strategies, all these public policy directives that he's recommending and that are taken into account by all of these local and state and even federal health officials, that's why they're so absurd, because he's trying to get to zero COVID. And he just admitted it. Here's the thing, though. Even New Zealand Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who is a nut, a total nut, even Ardern is abandoning a zero COVID strategy. Why? Because it's nutty. It's so nutty. But Fauci still thinks we should do that. That's why he's advocating, by the way, things like, I don't know if it's too soon to tell if you can gather for Christmas. He literally said that. Take a listen.
But we can gather for Christmas, or it's just too soon to tell?
You know, Margaret, it's just too soon to tell. We've just got to concentrating on continuing to get those numbers down and not try to jump ahead by weeks or months and say what we're going to do at a particular time.
Oh, okay. So let's just make one thing clear. I will be gathering with my family at Christmas period. Fauci's not my boss. He's not your boss either. He's nobody's boss. This is so ridiculous. But after a lot of people, by the way, had the same reaction that you're having, the same reaction that I'm having, because of this reaction, Fauci has flip-flopped. After he said that, he altered his statements. He said, well, it's probably okay for vaccinated people to gather at Christmas. And he said that his original comments were misinterpreted. So isn't that so special? How when he says something that he regrets, he then accuses us of being too stupid to understand what he originally said. Like, no, sir. I am perfectly able to interpret what you say. Perfectly able to interpret it. the proper interpretation actually is not only is he an idiot, not only is he not our boss, it's also interesting to note that now this is how the science works. The science changes relative to public backlash. That's not exactly the kind of science that I want ruling dictates from the federal government. Speaking of the federal government, CDC Director Walensky.
Unfortunately, I can't show you this part of the show, or the big tech overlords might delete this video and my channel. As you know, YouTube won't let me tell you the truth about COVID-19 or transgenderism and other important issues, even when I cite the specific studies. So if you want to watch the full uncensored version of this video, join me over on the Liz Wheeler Show community on Locals, lizwheelershow.com/locals.
So Senator Ted Cruz and I spoke recently about the ongoing border crisis in Del Rio, Texas, his state, the great free state of Texas, as he said. And we talked about why Haitians and why Del Rio all of a sudden. And I got to tell you, Senator Cruz knew the answer to this, and it's really, really illuminating. So if you are a Locals VIP, you have exclusive early access to this interview. Just go to LizWheelerShow.com/locals to see the full uncensored interview. It's really good, really interesting. LizWheelerShow.com/locals. Also, tune in for the Verdict Tour. Verdict with Ted Cruz is going on tour to college campuses. They'll be at the University of Wisconsin-Madison on October 13th. They'll be at Texas A&M University on October 14th. It's going to be great. They're going to live tape on stage in front of a live audience of college students. To find out how you can attend, go to yaf.org/verdict live. yaf.org/verdict live. You can also watch it live streaming on YouTube at Verdict with Ted Cruz, that channel, or the YAF TV channel. Verdict with Ted Cruz channel or the YAF TV channel. We're going to talk about former Vice President Mike Pence's comments and the mainstream media backlash against his comments about January 6th. We will cover that tomorrow. But right now, the great and powerful Jay Hay says, I got to stop talking. We are out of time for today. Before we are back, in the meantime, think for yourself. Use critical thought, question authority, follow the facts, and don't let government or corporate wokeism or cultural Marxism or anybody bully you into being a sheep. Please subscribe to the show. Give us a 5-star rating. Write us a glowing review. I read them all. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I'm Liz Wheeler. This is The Liz Wheeler Show.
The Liz Wheeler Show is produced by Jonathan Hay, executive producer Chad Abbott, director of photography Kevin McRoberts, editor Alejandro Figueroa, assistant editor Michael Wall, sound mixer Robin Fenderson, post-production manager Victoria Metzel, director of marketing Emily Washler, production and talent coordinator Matt Toffler, and senior publicist Patricia Jackson. This has been a Soundfront production.
If you haven't already, give this video a thumbs up, hit the subscribe button below, and ring the bell to make sure you never miss a video.